Just to recap very briefly, we got a big picture overview of some of the issues and trends around water issues and management in California. We got to hear about the work that Colorado Open Lands is doing around use of easements to protect groundwater. And then we heard about Washington Water Trust and their work with landowners to return water to in-stream flow. So there's a lot in there. I want to start with a question. We heard from California, Colorado, and Washington. We have participants in the room today from other states, including Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, I believe, Missouri. I may have missed a couple. So for folks who don't come from the states that our presenters came from, where would you suggest that people go to learn more about water management issues in their state, in their particular basin or watershed? How have, all three of you talked about being new to this topic. So how have you gone about learning about these issues, and how would you recommend that other people start?
I can start off here, I guess. I mean, in California, the easy thing to say is that PPIC Water Policy Center has great resources like fact sheets, 101s, great place to get started. But elsewhere where PPIC doesn't cover, I always tend to start out by going to extension professionals. And I think like the extension network, it's a little bit different in every state. I know there's a very robust network in Colorado and Washington as well. But these are great folks who can kind of take the latest research happening in the university and kind of make it work for people who actually need to use it, and kind of they're great translators. So that's been a good resource for me.
Yeah, I'll just say too, I know, Katie, you said, when you started doing this research, the landowners and irrigators that you worked with knew more than you did. And I honestly think they're a great place to start. Many of you also wear that hat, so which I recognize, but I do think, learning from folks, listening to their concerns, and the way that we do our work as a land trust, because we're statewide, is we try to go to the meetings where landowners are. And so there really are, and I echo Katie, Extension's great. We have a nonprofit group here in Colorado, the Foundation for Water Education, which does these great, lay-friendly handbooks on different water topics in the state. And I don't know how widespread that is, but it's super helpful as well. And I think don't be shy to ask for mentors or ask stupid questions as well. I still ask a lot.
Yeah, I would echo that. Not only asking landowners and farmers, but any other entity that you have seen around doing any sort of restoration work. They're bound to be able to connect you with someone. And then in Washington, we have conservation districts, local conservation districts in some areas that are extremely knowledgeable about the area, but also have tons of connections. And I know in Oregon, the counterpart are watershed councils. So I would look out for any of those. They might be more basin-wide or regional, but they can definitely point you to resources and access to information and just be really useful. And like Sarah said, ask any questions there. I still ask all of the questions and I'm constantly learning.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm seeing that Jim posted in the chat about a new movie that the University of New Mexico produced called Acequias, The Legacy Lives On, and he's provided a link to the trailer. My next question, we're talking a lot, and especially today, our presenters got a chance to hear just the tail end of some role plays that we were doing around how to open the conversation with producers around soil health. I'm curious to hear the three of you talk about how you think through approaching producers on these issues, whether it's the idea that they should think about transitioning to a different, less water intensive cropping system, whether it's opening the conversation about a groundwater easement, or whether it's talking about putting their water rights in trust. What are some strategies or best practices that you like to use or you've seen be successful?
I'm happy to kick off. I think because a lot of the places that we're meeting with that we're initially meeting landowners are sort of water focused meetings, it's very natural. It's so top of mind here, I think, for everybody, that it's almost strange not to talk about water. But we have, and I was going to post, I think several states at this point have a master irrigator program. I think this originally came out of Texas, but it's a really cool peer-to-peer program focused on kind of how to produce with less water. And participants are often paid to participate, or at least that was the original model out of Texas that a couple of our water districts, or river basins, I should say, here in Colorado have adopted. And so we've participated and presented in those master irrigator programs that producers go through. And that's a great connection point. If we're working with a landowner where there's not necessarily inherently a water focused conversation, I think it's part of helping them think through perpetuity and the future of their property. So just as you might be talking about, what kind of building rights do you want to retain in your conservation easement? It's also, I think, a conversation about where do you see water administration going in your area? Even if you're not necessarily thinking about participating in some sort of water conservation program, can we think about how that might be really important to your entire, to your neighbors, to your ditch, all of these things down the road. So I'll be quiet. That's worked for us.
I can talk a little bit about my experience, especially a lot of my work is in Eastern Washington, and there's definitely some reluctancy for landowners and water right holders to discuss any of their water right situation with an agency that could potentially get them in trouble. So I think one angle that is benefited us as a nonprofit, but also for conservation districts, it's the same, and other land trusts, is that we do have that non-agency, non-regulatory angle. So building up that trust with landowners is easier. But I will say the challenges are still hard to build up trust. And I think going off of what Sarah said a little bit, it's definitely that active listening and asking open-ended questions about what's working for their system, what's not working for their system, what they would like to see in the future, how they anticipate their growth to be in the next 10 years, and then really just being realistic about what you can and cannot do, especially when it comes to funding these projects, and being just honest. And then I think my supervisor always says this, but I think it's true. Do what you say you're going to do. If you tell them that you're going to follow up with something or more information or connect them, it's so much easier to build trust if you actually follow through with that. And it seems like a really simple thing to say, but when you're handling a lot of other work and balancing stuff out, some things fall. So keeping that in mind. But yeah, I think listening to concerns and figuring out how to build that trust up is really important.
Yeah, I think you two probably have a lot more experience with just on the ground work with farmers and growers than we do at the Water Policy Center, because we're more of taking the higher level view and what are the big policy implications of this, that, and the other. But we do work a lot with growers, and we do sit down in workshops and focus groups and all of this. And I think something interesting that I've been noticing is to invert your question a little bit, Addie, is one thing that has gotten farmers more intrigued about soil health and kind of management options that they can take that are sort of beneficial to soil health is because the connection with water use and water efficiency has become more clear. So very powerful commodity boards like the Almond Board of California have started funding agroecological research on soil health because of the water angle, because that's so key in California, and it's a big part of making a viable business in California agriculture. So it's a little bit of the water conversation actually has enabled the soil health conversation a little bit, which has been interesting to see. And I think from our sort of higher level stakeholder work with growers, the biggest thing is just always being very clear on what the incentives are. If you're suggesting some management alternatives or land use transition, you can talk about the public benefit creation all day long, but at the end of the day, farming is a business, and farmers are thinking about how to keep things going from year to year. So they need to know, like, how does this pencil out for me, and how, and who funds it, and is this, do I really want to get into a government program, or are there other ways that this can pay for itself, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really important to be very clear about that, and kind of understand where growers are coming from in that way.
Thanks for that. And I guess building off of that question, or building off of what you just said about incentives, Katie, we've talked quite a bit this week about barriers to soil health practices adoption, the reasons why producers might be slow or reluctant to try on new practices. What are some either sort of examples of pushback that you've received from growers, or examples of barriers or challenges that producers are facing when considering a new approach to water management?
Well, I'll say when it comes to surface water, I think one of the biggest concerns about doing something different is that loss, because it is, it's that catch-22 of, it's increasingly scarce, it's increasingly expensive, all these things, and yet it's also therefore an increasingly valuable asset that people have. And so how do you help folks look at resources like the Water Trust in Washington, or Colorado has a water trust as well, without, or an agricultural municipal lease, without jeopardizing their historical consumptive use, which is what they would need to demonstrate to sell or change that water right. And so it's that delicate balance. And I think where the space where we've been interested in, can we use a conservation easement in our case to establish sort of some certainty, but also allow for shorter term arrangements that might provide different diversified income opportunities without people necessarily losing that historic use that's so important. So I think that's a big barrier, is that fear, a real fear of that asset loss. And I'll just say quickly, it's been really interesting here in Colorado. I mentioned that there are more investment firms that are participating in the agricultural market. Sort of the one that gets classically hammered is called water assets management, which is buying farms on the Colorado River. And I think that, so we had in Colorado here over the last year, the administration convened a working group to try to figure out whether we should pass legislation that would prohibit water speculation in the state somehow. And this was a really divisive issue we saw for farmers, where on one hand, they were seeing the value of water rights be pushed up by this type of participation in the market. But on the other hand, it's the backup plan if somebody, gets cancer and there's not enough in the bank account. So how do you kind of help farmers address these real concerns by potentially creating new incentives or creating policy changes within your state law that enable these sorts of cooperative and flexible arrangements that Katie was speaking to without costing them their valuable asset?
Yeah, it's interesting you should mention that, Sarah, because a very similar thing was just introduced in the California legislature this year, sort of an anti-speculation thing that would prohibit investment firms, venture capital from participating in trading or buying water rights. And I think eventually, correct me if I'm wrong, that measure didn't have legs in Colorado, and I suspect it's probably not going to have legs in California either, simply because it's already difficult for farmers to engage in trading, and they're not going to be too excited about making it more difficult. And water trading, especially in California, is one of the best tools that we have to kind of mitigate the economic costs of this transition to sustainability, because it allows the water to go to where it's most valuable, which in our case is a lot of times the perennial, the nut crops and the vegetables. So yeah, I just think that's an interesting parallel there, where we're kind of following along in Colorado's footsteps and seeing if we can do the same thing, but I feel like it's going to play out the same way. And California is interesting too, just because of that context of being such a high value production environment. And I come along talking about, what if we plant more winter forages and wheat and stuff? And people are like, what? Why would I do that when I can earn, thousands of dollars an acre with my almonds and with my pistachios? So getting that messaging right has been a challenge for sure. And that, we're not talking about growing dryland crops instead of growing a high value specialty crop. We're talking about doing that instead of doing nothing, and that this transition is sort of inevitable, and it's about finding a more optimal outcome than just letting a bunch of land go fallow and everything else is in almonds, basically. So that's been an interesting kind of storytelling journey. And then another thing that I thought was interesting about your talk on Colorado, Sarah, was that you reminded me that everything in the San Luis Valley is metered. And I was like, oh, that's why it works. Because in California, metering is still a really contentious issue, and it's considered like government overreach and all this stuff. So somebody like PPIC comes along and says, we really need ways to like have accountability in our water systems and be able to measure like the net benefit of any conservation. Everyone's like, if you're talking about putting meters on my well, then I'm not interested. So there's been a lot of pushback there, but
and I'd be curious, Katie, I feel like that's where some of this like peer-to-peer stuff becomes so important, because if we had farmers from the San Luis Valley talking with farmers in California to say, we were real skeptical about this too, but now we've seen how it enables these other tools.
Yeah, exactly. It's been the people who are like, trying out cover crops to see if that's like more favorable than like a bare winter fallow in terms of keeping their water in the soil. And, you know, these are the people that are like, if I had a meter on my well, I could go to my irrigation district and say, look, it's right here. I only applied this much water. The rest was like evapotranspiration, blah, blah, blah. Like it wasn't all consumptive use, and I have the data to show it. And that kind of measurement and accountability gives them the power to do that. So they're not quite there yet, but there are some people in the forefront who are pushing that conversation, and it is a peer-to-peer thing, right? That's where most of the progress gets made in my mind.
Sarah, I was curious. I was just thinking too about how it feels like the layering of different programs, like making sure that I, as a land trust, am not operating in a silo, but thinking about how my tools interact with other tools that are out there, and the programs that you, like that long list of options that you referenced was so impressive. I was curious how you achieve that, how you work in your state with other groups.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, for water transactions are like those big water rights that we can put back into stream. Those projects have been done. So now it's this, I mean, it's a really great innovative time, but also slightly intimidating time as well, figuring out how all of this stuff is going to work. But a lot of it comes down to really figuring out who else is doing the work in the basin. And now a lot of our projects are like the ones that I talked about in the Tushi River. It has some habitat component, it has some flow component, it may have irrigation efficiency component. And I think that actually has allowed a lot more landowners and water right holders to sign on to these sorts of projects. I think a lot of the pushback that we've gotten is very similar to what you were talking about, Sarah. If you do an efficiency project that saved water, is that permanently in trust now? And if my system breaks and I need to go back to my old system, what happens? If I want to change crops to a higher water use crop, but I've lost that excess water, what happens? And so thinking how we can combine a lot of these water saving projects that have worked in the past but might not have provided that security with more flexible temporary leases in the trust program, so you can, after 5 years, if it didn't work, take it out, use that water again, we'll think of something else that could possibly work better. So that's helped, but definitely a lot of the pushback, especially with less water reliability, people don't want to kind of open the hood up to what's happened in the past, especially not if ecology is going to come looking around. And metering is something that makes our life really a lot easier when we have to take all that data to ecology, because we can tell the landowner, you know exactly what you've been using. It's clearly outlined. There's this document that says it. Ecology can't challenge it. But when we're just relying on maybe an affidavit of water use and some aerial imagery with mapping, it's a lot more suspect. And so really having those upfront and honest conversations with the landowner of what could happen. But I've seen a lot of projects go south because of that, when there's just not enough water to transact, or the financial incentive is just not there. And then, I mean, I totally get it. Then obviously a landowner's probably not going to sign on. But yeah, it's an interesting balance, but I think having a ton of partners that you can rely upon, my biggest is probably the tribes and then the conservation district in the area. Funding is always an issue, but I think a lot of these multi-benefit projects can pull a lot of different funding source in, which has helped. It's just figuring out the timing of all of that is always fun.
Thanks so much. I have one more question, and then we'll take questions from the group. So folks, feel free to put things in the chat, but you've got another minute or two to think. My last question for our presenters, our participants in the training after today are going to go out and develop soil health action plans to help guide them and their organizations to start doing more work related to soil health and thinking through how they can be engaging their landowners around the topic of soil health. What advice do you three have for how folks can start integrating, I'm going to call it a water lens into their soil health work with producers and with the communities they serve?
Yeah, I think this touches back to what I was saying earlier, which is actually just that water is so front and center to a lot of growers in the West, but that connection with soil as sort of the medium for kind of holding it and moving it around in the field is not always as apparent. And the way that soil health impacts that is not always as apparent. So that connection between soil health as a way to improve the efficiency of your water use, improve the hydrology of your on-farm, it is like a really important connection to make, I think. And that's sort of one of the private on-farm benefits of soil health that I think is important to emphasize.
I think I would also say too, along those same lines, I mean, water is such an important factor here in the West, and I think it's probably going to come up in every conversation. But I would pay attention to, I've touched on this kind of throughout my talking points, but the partners that are already focusing more on the water lens and don't try to recreate the wheel when you don't have to. If there's resources that you can pull from them, maybe it's partner presentations, kind of using them as ways to put water back into the conversation so that the work doesn't all have to fall on you. And then it just creates more collaborative projects as well. So that would be something that I've learned. Yeah.
I don't have anything insightful to add. I think that was all great. So I'll leave more time for other questions.
Thanks so much. So we've got a question here in the chat from Christy Smith, and I think this is for Sarah DeMickey. For the program that uses recycled water for irrigation, where is that recycled water coming from?
So for the Sammamish Valley research project, that recycled water is actually coming from a wastewater treatment plant in King County called Brightwater. And they currently produce Class A recycled water, and they're positioned really well in the basin to have a gravity flow pipe that actually follows the river to distribute that recycled water. But for our overall kind of regional concept that we're exploring, we're looking at, I think there's 13 wastewater treatment plants around Puget Sound region right now that produce Class A recycled water, which is that highest form of treatment and can be actually used to irrigate crops. So we're looking at where there might be water right source switch opportunities within a certain buffer of each of those plants. But there's also a new regulation from Ecology that's actually going to look at all 56 wastewater treatment plants that are currently discharging to the Puget Sound and figuring out how to reduce that discharge and nutrient loading into the sound itself. And so we're exploring possibilities of potentially upgrading some of those systems to Class A through other funding sources, and again, using other partners as resources for that. And then figuring out where you could potentially keep water in stream and then source out the recycled water to other irrigators in each of those areas. So long-term project, hopefully more results to come that I can share at potentially other presentations.
Thanks, Sarah. We have a question from Chantal. How are you all seeing agrivoltaics, the combination of solar and agriculture, as interacting with water use reduction? And or how can agrivoltaics interact with or not interact with conservation easements? That's a big question.
Well, I was super excited to see Katie's mapping work of, I think that was really interesting, kind of pairing land to be, anticipated to be fallowed with solar potential. It's definitely something we're also looking at in the San Luis Valley in particular. There's lots of interest certainly in agrivoltaics in our state right now. There's like a super sexy project called Jack's Solar Farm on the Front Range of Colorado, where there's lots of cool research being done on sort of small scale veggie production and things like that, what grows best under panels. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a county in Colorado that just put a moratorium on solar development on irrigated acreage. Alyssa and Diane, you probably know about this in Montrose County, because of a concern that that water rights could be abandoned because this solar farm would not have been able to use the amount of water that had historically been consumed. And so there was a concern that water could be lost. And so so that's sort of the two ends of the spectrum here. But I think the places where land is inherently going to come out of production is sort of a space where it feels like we can really think and talk creatively to say, great, we're working to conserve these areas. Are we conserving them to the extent that we are eliminating any future for economic activity in this area? Or can we really look at solar as a way to not only replace economic resilience, or add economic resilience, I should say, that's being lost by ag production, irrigated ag production, but also potentially can we think about, we're working with Colorado State University to put together a research proposal right now for properties in the San Luis Valley that would kind of look at, can solar panels potentially actually improve revegetation efforts? Can you use that to improve soil moisture, look at shade effects? Are there, potential ecological benefits? So instead of looking at this as something that's inherently incompatible with conservation outcomes, how do we look at it in the face of actually, adding to a community's ecological and economic viability over the long term?
Yeah, I would sort of echo what Sarah said. And when we're looking at solar sort of from the lens of that map that I showed earlier as an alternative to fallowing on lands that are losing their water, agrivoltaics sort of becomes a more limited conversation because we're talking about lands that it needs to come out of production anyway. So it's sort of limited to things that can be done under panels and that don't need any water. So if you can do some dry land, maybe forage production, small scale grazing, that's probably the extent of what you could do under solar panels. And again, it requires the right incentives and the right kind of agreement with solar developers. And there are a lot of kind of hurdles to jump through there to make it work, at least on these transitioning farmlands. So it's something that needs a little more attention. In terms of like land that's not already dewatered and that's sort of in that middle space, and then where we wanted to see some incremental savings, maybe. There is some recent research that's kind of confirming this theory that vegetation or crops under panels are kind of creating co-benefits. So the panels shade the crops and get a water benefit there. The crops cool the panel, so you get an energy benefit there. There is some kind of recent research that suggests that may be the case, and so we may see some kind of co-benefits there. But again, it seems that so far this works best on a small scale, something like Jack's Solar Farm, where we're not trying to do big harvesting operations and figuring out how to work that in between panels with whole new equipment and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's like a lot to discuss there still, but it's still in its infancy a little bit. I do think the solar and habitat conversation is also potentially kind of, there's a lot of potential for multi-benefit projects there, where you're not as concerned about having to do maintenance operations or agronomic operations incorporated with panels. But what Sarah was saying about the third-party considerations and considering workforce development and community development and all that's going to be really important, especially when we're talking about converting from labor-intensive agriculture to something that's not so labor-intensive.
This is still a learning edge subject for me, so I don't have too much to add. A lot of the ways that we've thought about incorporating solar into our projects right now is mostly like for larger irrigation companies or cities to offset some of their pumping costs if there's like a surface water switch to groundwater. But this conversation is making me think, especially for some of our West Side projects, is there a way to better incorporate it on some of the smaller scale projects that could have a lot of the multi-benefits? So thanks for giving me a lot of food for thought on this one.
Thanks for all of those thoughtful answers. We have a question from Katie Goots. Katie says, I'm wondering if any of you have found useful models incorporating water rights protections into conservation easements or baseline reports.
Yeah, Katie, great question. So I would say, I think at least in Colorado, and I think this is true for a lot of the West, it feels like because conservation easements were a tool that came from the East Coast and moved west, it was like initially water was an afterthought. And so conservation easements were just like, and the water. And then it feels like the more we learned and the more water rights attorneys got involved in conservation, it became like, how do we lock the water rights down, onto this property forever? And now it feels like we're in this space where it's like, maybe that has some unintended consequences too. So how do we incorporate that permanence and certainty with that flexibility? And so we do have conservation easement language that I would be very happy to share. And we do a water rights memo that accompanies each of our projects that tries to speak to, historic water use, contextual information about the water rights. And then we also have components of our baseline checklists that speak to documenting water rights as well. So I'm happy to share all of that. And I'll also put in the chat a link to a guide that we put out a few years ago that's just our way that we've sort of shifted to in terms of that flexibility. It's called Sharing Water to Save the Farm, and it has some template language. Our current language is slightly different. This is a couple years old, but I'm happy to share that.
Just to follow up on that, we talked earlier this week about the use of management plans as a tool to accompany conservation easements. Primarily, we focused earlier on the use of management plans to work with landowners around soil health practices. I wonder if there's an opportunity within that management plan framework to also talk about sort of evolving use of water. Barring any other questions, I'll just bring us to a close here and say a really wholehearted thank you to Katie and Sarah for taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise with us. I think if there's a sort of one takeaway for me that bubbles to the top that I'm going to be really mulling on is this idea that on some level, water, when we think about approaching soil health with producers who might be sort of slower to adopt, it may ultimately be starting with the topic of water and water scarcity that enables us to open that question and to approach some of these soil health practices through the need and urgency that's driven by our water situation. So thank you for helping to frame this in that way. And I look forward to more collaboration and conversation with all of you on that.